thanks very much. I'm really happy to have a chance to talk to you about this film. It's a wonderful film if you haven't seen it, but for me to be able to talk to it, it's not really a thriller, so they're not literally spoilers. But I will have to talk about the film in some way that prepares you for what you're about to see. Jia Zhangke's 2013 film Touch of Sin was something of a shock for his admirers. His earlier films, like Still Life and about the building of the Three Gorges Dam in China and the vast consequences for the villagers whose lives were changed forever by their removal from an area where their ancestors had lived for thousands of years, and films like Platform and Unknown Pleasures, subtle treatments of the endlessly complicated psychological effects of fundamental social upheaval, were all explorations of the dizzying changes occurring in Chinese society after the economic reforms, the introduction of private markets, by Deng Xiaoping in 1978, called then and still called today socialism with Chinese characteristics. It means mostly socialism with billionaires. But those admirers of the subtlety and great beauty of Jia's films were not prepared for the violence and bleakness of Touch of Sin, or the nihilism in the lives of the characters depicted, nihilism that was disturbing because it was so credible. The film consists of 4 different stories, and only the first has explicitly to do with the political state. In this case, the village administrator, its accountants, and their ties to the richest man in the village. All the stories, though, have to do with being driven to a kind of breaking point, various intense, violent, and dramatic ways of depicting how a form of social life, now here consumerist, individualistic, and unequal, is coming into view in China that is literally unbearable. The political story, the first one, concerns a miner driven to desperation by the corruption of his village's leaders. The other 3 depict the social and interpersonal implications of the market reforms on Chinese society. The second is about a man, the most completely remorseless and nihilistic character in the film, who prefers the random thrills and violence of an outlaw and quick and easy money to the border of village life. The third concerns an adulterous woman depressed by the constant false promises of her lover to leave his wife, and while not herself a sex worker, finds herself caught up in the commodification of sex more and more common in the new consumer society, and is driven again to a violent breaking point. The last tells the story of a young man, about your age, drifting from one meaningless and degrading job to another, including a stint as a waiter in a bizarre brothel, and again, finally driven to an act of desperation. In effect, we have something like psychological studies of vengeance, nihilism, sudden but pent-up rage, and despair, and all are tied to the process of rapid Chinese modernization, the most rapid modernization and urbanization in the history of the world. As we shall see, each has something to do with the attempt by human beings to preserve some sense of dignity in a society ever more indifferent to such concerns. The film ends with a brief melancholic coda, a short narrative about the adulterous woman from the third story trying to start her life anew. She watches a piece of traditional Chinese opera, and it is from this performance that we learn why the English title of the film is what it is. An interesting aspect of all these stories is that while focused on individuals, they all manage to raise very general questions, not only about the kinds of social pathologies, forms of shared psychological ill health visible in China's new consumer capitalism, like resentment, deep boredom, humiliating inequalities, the disorienting loss of both traditional Chinese customs and values, as well as the loss of the solidarity of the revolutionary socialist ideal, the weakness of both the extended and the nuclear family, the commodification of women as sex workers, and the soul-deadening nature of modern factory labor. Besides doing all that, they raise such questions at such a fundamental level that the questions pertain not just to Chinese society, but to modern society itself, the organization of labor for the production of private profit, and the political institutions that both regulate and protect such a system. The film seems even to question whether any organization of state power in such a society, given such consumerist pathologies, justified by any political argument like the consent of the governed or the minimal mutual protection of its individuals from each other, or by appeal to the greatest happiness for the greatest number, could possibly be acceptable. That's the basic question I think is raised by this powerful film. I said that the film depicts various social pathologies plaguing contemporary China, and that requires some explanation. It's generally a metaphor. Whole societies cannot really be spiritually sick or healthy, but it's a useful one. And like the organic notion of health, requires a way of understanding the interrelation of parts that contribute to the organism's proper or good functioning. So what do we mean by the proper and good functioning of a society? Consider first that our natures and the scarcity of resources ensure that any individual, in obtaining what he or she wants and needs, inevitably affects and often conflicts with what others want and need and try to obtain. This finitude means we are inevitably competitive creatures. We have no choice but to be somewhat wary of others in some sense. But such finitude also means that we are unable to secure efficiently what we want and need by ourselves, even in small groups and associations. We must also cooperate, often on a very large and complex scale, especially in a society where the division of labor ensures that we are able to perform only a very small part of what is necessary for achieving a level of wealth by ourselves, a level that also allows for the creation of leisure and some attention to our private lives. The combination of these two obvious and commonplace facts means that however cooperatively a society or segment of society is, a relation that depends basically on relations of trust, our awareness of our self-interest and competitiveness means we must ensure compliance with any cooperative program. We need, in other words, laws, rules, and some standard for what those rules can and cannot be, or a basic law or a constitution, and therefore a state or policy of some sort to enforce them. We need the police. Since such a state will enjoy a monopoly on the legitimate use of coercion and force, a primary question in political thought is, as it was once described by Max Weber, what distinguishes the violent rule of one group of people over another from legitimate political rule? As you no doubt will learn in this sequence or in other courses, some philosophers like Marx and Nietzsche argue there is no such difference, that what looks like legitimate political rule is just the violent rule of one group or class or Nietzsche type over another. But that's not the only question of politics. Whatever organization of, range of, and restrictions on the use of such power, we also have to count on a form of social existence that is consistent with, in some way at one with, the ideals embodied in the basic law. By form of social life, I mean simply how we organize productive labor, what conventions are authoritative in marriage and family life, the role of religion or several religions in a society, how we organize our educational institutions, what norms define for us what is significant, what trivial, what sacred, what profane. It would be to invoke a very old word with too many associations to say that any form of political life must assume and strive to sustain some ideal state of the human soul, a kind of health or flourishing. But however old-fashioned, it's still a pretty accurate description. And just as a polluted, toxic environment can produce organic ill health, it's another commonplace to admit that there are forms of social life that incline participants to sick souls, to commonly shared pathologies. These can not only damage commitment to the common ideals necessary for the political state to function well, but even threaten any basic allegiance to that state at all. And these pathologies sometimes have organic-sounding manifestations. High rates of divorce or crime, alcoholism, drug and opioid addiction, corruption. But it may still be that such clinical symptoms can be said to have social causes. And I want to discuss how Touch of Sin addresses the vast and complicated problem of these social pathologies. The critical theorist Theodor Adorno once remarked that it is impossible to live righteously in a form of life that is itself wrong. For one thing, participants often have no way to formulate to themselves what is wrong, just feel it in some way, they sense it as they sicken. For another, there are very few forms of effective resistance, if the rot goes that deep into psychological nature. But first, let me say a few words about the film as a film, a cinematic form. First, the English title, Touch of Sin, is likely a double reference. Now, the Chinese title, Jian Su Ding, means something like ordained by the gods, and I haven't been able to discover if Jia or a distributor gave it the English title. I doubt that he would allow it to go out without some authority over the title. Whoever gave it that title probably knew that the famous wuxia director and important innovator King Hu's 1971 film, Jia Liu, was translated as Touch of Zen. That's also not the correct translation of that film. But nevertheless, it's the English title. Wuxia films, as many of you know, are what we call martial arts films, but of the magical realism kind, where people can fly, leap dozens of feet in the air while doing elaborate somersaults and so forth. And we are in this country, if we're not martial arts fanatics, know the technique from Ang Lee's famous film, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. There's thus a reference immediately to Chinese films of the past, and so the question whether they are a form in which contemporary China can be understood, and I think that the answer is no. And the role of Chinese tradition in contemporary China. As you'll see, Touch of Sin makes several references to traditional Chinese theater, music, and village customs. And as we'll also see, most of the references are ironic or melancholic, especially in the second story, where the so-called lone samurai turns out to be not one who rights wrongs, but to murder indiscriminately. But more obviously, Touch of Sin is a reference to Orson Welles' famous 1958 film noir, Touch of Evil, for many people the last of the film noir genre. That would certainly fit, since in that film a corruption of public power is not only a major issue, the corruption is so deep and its pathological effects so profound that there seems no possible escape from it or reform ever. The terrorization of women as an aspect of such corruption is also a common theme in the two films. The Chinese title, Ordained by the Gods, has that sense of fatalism common to film noir, that once we start down a certain path, take some action, the consequences and implications are no longer in our control. We become the onlookers and victims of events, not their source. And this certainly may be a reference to the unintended consequences of the market reforms of the 80s. And what we are seeing has been ordained by the gods around Deng Xiaoping in '78 and are now becoming painfully visible and uncorrectable. So consider what we see in each of the four stories. There is a common imagistic theme uniting the stories that you can detect: animals. A horse being mercilessly beaten in the first corruption story. The duck, a little girl's pet duck, having its throat cut in the second story of nihilism. Snakes kept in a cabin as part of some carnival show in the third adultery story. There's also a lot of shots of a monkey, cows, bulls wander through the various narratives. And fish in the fourth story of despair and alienation. So as if deliberately, a mammal, a bird, a reptile, and a fish, covering a good deal of the animal kingdom, as if referring to different but generically common pathologies. Animals, of course, have symbolic meanings in Chinese literature and art, but in this case, we might note that the mistreatment of animals is a measure of basic humanity or inhumanity, and in different ways we are being reminded that each of these stories treats a different form of inhumanity. The human treatment of animals also mirrors to some extent the human treatment of humans, turned into tools of use, commodified for the purposes of those with power over them. In the first story, the horse, liberated from its vicious owner by our avenging angel, stands for an image of the new social order, wandering driverless, aimlessly, purposelessly through the streets. In the dialogue, animals are mentioned twice, once as the object of hunting, and in the third story as beings which can suffer despair and can even commit suicide. Humans, even if turned into something like animals at repetitive labor all day that makes no use of their capacities as human beings, or into object-like tools for male pleasure, can still have one dramatic measure of revolt left, like animals. We'll see an example. The segments are also linked, as if to say they all treat the same generic issue in four species different ways. The first two are linked because we see both main characters of each together, and even the tomatoes or spilled vegetables from the first film but in the first story that you'll see in the first image of the film, turn up on a table very subtly in the second. The adulterous male in the third is the rather cold-hearted factory manager in the fourth. And they're also linked thematically. As we'll see, each has to do with resentment and some moment of vengeance, long a powerful theme in movies. And as mentioned, the struggle for some sort of dignity, some worthy standing in society is everywhere present. It's worth considering in this context what it means that all the forms of resistance to this diminished standing are violent and extra-legal. It may have something to do with the fact that such dignity and standing cannot be otherwise legislated into existence, cannot be demanded by law. Enforced respect, after all, is not really respect. And the source of the diminished standing is systematic and structural, not personal and individual in a way that might be corrected by punitive law. The first and fourth stories remind us that whereas one aspect of the social bond required for collective flourishing had been provided by traditional Chinese culture, by Confucianism, Buddhism, and ritual, theater, art, and village practices, that function was taken over by the socialist ideals of Mao's revolution. And the point is clearly, those socialist ideals are no longer in effect. And the question is, what remains of the social bond, if anything? Note also the truck in the first story carrying a picture of the Virgin Mary, very briefly, an evocation of the faint and implausible aspiration for perhaps a new religious order as foundation. The early shot of Mao's statue in the mining town already seems anachronistic, as anachronistic as the much older totem we eventually also see. In the fourth story, there is even a demonstration of how completely theatrical and phony references to those socialist ideals has become, as a group of young prostitutes parade around in the skimpy uniforms of communist youth cadre. Later, they parade around in skimpy versions of traditional Chinese dress, making the same ironic point about the two cultural bonds that are now lost in China and have not been replaced with anything else. The first two stories especially clearly reference what we now call spaghetti westerns, or Clint Eastwood, or Sergio Leone movies. In this case, a lone gunman, but here riding motorcycles, not horses. And the references are ironic. The situation is much the same, a chaotic disorder caused by the breakdown in law, in corruption or open flaunting, or a collapse of confidence. But our gunmen are both deeply ironic avatars of the lone gunman with no name in those films. The first gunman is clearly a maniac, and the second is a nihilistic sociopath. They certainly do not bring the social order back into balance by removing some evil clique or gunfighter who had been terrorizing the town. They are part of the terror. Consider now some of the details of the stories and how they might bear on the question of social pathology, keeping in mind that the question is not isolated to Chinese societies alone. The question is much broader. Without reliance on tradition or revolutionary solidarity or even a genuine common commitment to an ideal, to something bigger than oneself, can a society united mostly by its regulated pursuit of self-interest, defined largely through consumption, the status of wealth, or even the private ownership of capital itself, be anything but unhealthy in just these ways? The first story and the film begin with a visual image of the general state of life in the village, a kind of chaos and disunity, a mere heap of individual atoms, a truck overturned, spilling its cargo, apparently tomatoes, over the street. Our first anti-hero, Dahai, sits by the truck, indifferently tossing one of the spilled tomatoes. He's even dressed in the long coat favored by the characters in Italian westerns. Here the first two stories overlap, as we also see in the scene Susan, also on a motorcycle. This overlap already raises a cinematic question. What's the difference between Dahai's apparently righteous murder spree and Zhu's nihilistic revenge, or rampage? How much is Dahai's killing motivated by righteousness, and how much by his own resentment and desire for his share? Note that Dahai also kills a man just because he calls him a new nickname, and another because he was beating that horse. They are also paired by both riding motorcycles, perhaps a mark of their asociality, and they ride past each other at the wreck, pairing them again. Zhu is confronted shortly thereafter by bandits and coldly shoots them all, even pursuing one who tries to escape. Now, extra-legal and murderous self-defense is also a staple of action movies, and inevitably, but also dangerously, excites an audience's identification. This is no doubt a reference to, and here I'll probably exceed your fund of film references because I'm going back too far in time, Charles Bronson-type Avenger movies, a series, if you want to see any, called Death Wish. Death Wish 1, 2, 3, 4. They made a lot of money from 1974 to 87. Or to their type of movie. Specifically here, I think Taxi Driver would be another example when DeHaye finally decides to avenge the village on those responsible for the corruption. Back at the spill, you'll see in the early part of the film, very early, the truck suddenly explodes. A foreshadowing of the suddenness with which each of the characters will explode in reaction to their despair. But what is most interesting is the rather indifferent air of spectatorship among all those present at the crash, and this is quite relevant to the corruption issue. While we learn later that there's no question that the village leader and his accountant are taking payoffs, and that the mine's owner has reneged on a promise to share the profits of the sale of the collectively owned mine with all the villagers, an important dramatic element of the story is that while these facts are never in dispute, only DeHaye is outraged. Some admire the fact that the owner got so rich, admire his Audi and his jet plane. Others argue that DeHaye would do the same if he had the chance. On the bus towards the end of the first story, he cannot even get anyone to listen to him. No one cares. And that, too, is a kind of pathology. He can't even get the local postmistress to mail his letter of complaint to province headquarters. It's been a staple of political critiques of democracy since Plato, or from Plato to Tocqueville, that democratic life would be distorted by envy of the rich and indignation at inequality. But not in this village, and perhaps not even in a country as burdened with inequality as ours. For all the critique of elites, we just elected a billionaire after all, a man not so different in his wealth-displaying contemptuousness as the owner of the village. What does that mean? Another question, the relation between what DeHaye hears right before the transition to his going all taxi driver in a Chinese theater piece, and why that precedes his rampage. In the second story, we get our only good picture of traditional village life, the life that is disappearing quickly with the onset of urbanization. Here the family remains relatively intact. The brothers, including Sue, our nihilist, have gathered to celebrate their mother's 70th birthday. And the elaborate, careful counting and dividing of the birthday money is an emphasis on the scrupulous honesty shown by the older brother and directly meant to contrast the corruption of the new village we've seen. And these notions of virtue, clearly have not taken root in the brother Sue. He has a family there, a wife and a child, and none of the other brothers live in the village anymore but him, and they cannot even get home at the right time for the mother's birthday. A new temporal order runs their lives, one indifferent to their family and to family obligations. We see nothing that would help explain why Sue has turned out the way he has, and the extent of his cold-bloodedness makes any question of meaning, of what it means to him that he does this, why he thinks he can, what he's trying to do, why he would murder a person for her purse, impossible even to raise. We hear later about a woman, wife of a corrupt official, who's collected 1,000 expensive purses, but seems mentioned only to remind us that even this sort of motive, an attack on frivolous luxury and inequality, has no bearing on our nihilist action. There's simply nothing in the world that gets any grip on him as a goal, besides aspiring to buy a better and faster loading gun. The third story is the most complicated. It intertwines the story of Xiao Yu, a receptionist at a massage parlor and brothel, and what happens to her there, with her adulterous long-time affair with Zhang Yang. There's an obvious connection. Two men treat her as a prostitute at the brothel simply because she's a woman and she's there. And Zhang's wife calls her a whore when attacking her for seducing her husband, clearly figuring Xiao's own worry that she might be no different from the women in the brothel, given that the man will never divorce his wife and she'll always remain his girl on the side. The status of women in consumerist capitalism is the obvious issue raised. The picture of that status is not pretty, nor is the action taken by Xiao her only option when the man tries to force himself on her. Here, her moves suddenly do look like traditional martial art moves, invoking the wuxia sense of injustice violently punished. And once again, as with the Hive, we also feel a twinge of satisfaction that the man is getting what he deserves, although it's the horrible effects of the violence on Xiao that the segment focuses on. As in so many instances of the film's characters, especially Xiao for the rest of the film, including the coda, wander about unconnected, placeless, and alienated, utterly alone, with no real solidarity anymore with family, other villagers, work colleagues, and so forth. We recall the horse from the first story. Could be an image for each of the characters. Notice how many times the camera isolates her, has her in a frame with no other person, and notice especially the scene in the snake trade. Two women, one trying to give some comfort to the other, just beaten by the wife and by others, as those male images, snakes, slither creepily on the floor. Trapped in a world of such snakes would not be an incorrect reading of the scene. The fourth segment is the most poignant. Xiao Hui, a young factory worker, quit his job rather than give up his salary for 2 weeks to pay for an injury to another worker that the foreman says he caused. However, we learn it's not the money that bothers him, but that he will be working for the other worker, and he finds that demeaning. So the issue here and throughout the segment, throughout all of them, is again status, some recognition of the dignity and worth of the individual. The question here obviously being whether the relations of power and the nature of the repetitive labor that you see will allow any such credible status and respect in such a system. As he tries another job in a weird brothel, he finds no better. One of the prostitutes befriends him, and they take a shine to each other, and his dreamy wish to go away with her confronts not only the reality of her life, of life itself, we might say, in this world, but the demeaning labor that prostitution really requires. He watches as she begins to service an older client and cannot bear it. And at that moment, I think neither can we. And leaves for yet another factory job, no more satisfying than the first. In a call from his whiny, complaining mother, who apparently always calls to demand more money, he appears to break emotionally and takes his vengeance on the trapped life he must lead in the only tragic way available to him. In the brief coda at the end, Xiao, the adulterating woman from the third story, returns, now very different. No makeup, shorter hair, with an air of resignation and melancholy. She's applied for a new job, and she's asked if her past problems, which the interviewer apparently knows, are behind her. After the film we've just seen, that question is loaded with heavy irony. For it was not her problem that she was treated poorly by her lover, attacked by his wife, and had to fight off an attempt to rape. It's as if she's being asked, is the world that was created by what Deng Xiaoping unleashed, the values and incentives created, the commodification of sex and women, the corruption, behind us now? Will it ever be behind us? And the answer is obviously not, but she must pretend in this scene that it is. The film ends with her watching yet another anachronistic Chinese opera, although in this case it turns out to be quite relevant. The last words we hear, repeated twice, as the camera shows us Xiao's face with a slightly pained expression, as if applying the question to herself, is, do you understand your sin? Said to a woman in the opera who tells us she's being forced to confess. The question echoes, to some extent, the one we had just heard. Have you put your trouble behind you, as if it were her trouble, her sin? And we then, as the film closes, see a panorama of ordinary faces with that question lingering. The irony hangs in the air, for all the suffering we have seen is not tied to any sin, so much so that the very question of individual responsibility, certainly of sin, when considered in the light of the massive social changes and their profound psychological consequences, has come to seem like simply the wrong question in this context. So I hope you enjoy the film. It's really quite well done. Thank you.